O Lord, your word is a lamp to our feet and a light to our path. Give us grace to receive your truth in faith and love, and strength to follow on the path you set before us, through Jesus Christ. Amen.
Those who had arrested Jesus took him to Caiaphas, the high priest, where the teachers of the law and the elders had assembled. But Peter followed him at a distance, right up to the courtyard of the high priest. He entered and sat down with the guards to see the outcome. The chief priests and the whole Sanhedrin were looking for false evidence against Jesus so that they could put him to death. But they did not find any, though many false witnesses came forward. Finally, 2 came forward and declared, "This fellow said, 'I am able to destroy the temple of God and rebuild it in 3 days.'" Then the high priest stood up and said to Jesus, "Are you not going to answer? What is this testimony that these men are bringing against you?" But Jesus remained silent. The high priest said to him, "I charge you under oath by the living God. Tell us if you are the Messiah, the Son of God." "You have said so," Jesus replied. "But I say to all of you, from now on you will see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of the Mighty One and coming on the clouds of heaven." Then the high priest tore his clothes and said, "He has spoken blasphemy. Why do we need any more witnesses? Look, now you have heard the blasphemy. What do you think?" "He is worthy of death," they answered. Then they spit in his face and struck him with their fists. Others slapped him and said, "Prophesy to us, Messiah. Who hit you?" Now Peter was sitting out in the courtyard, and a servant girl came to him. "You also were with Jesus of Galilee," she said. But he denied it before them all. "I don't know what you're talking about," he said. Then he went out to the gateway, where another servant girl saw him and said to the people there, "This fellow was with Jesus of Nazareth." He denied it again with an oath, "I don't know the man." After a little while, those standing there went up to Peter and said, "Surely you are one of them. Your accent gives you away." Then he began to call down curses, and he swore to them, "I don't know the man." Immediately a rooster crowed. Then Peter remembered the word Jesus had spoken, "Before the rooster crows, you will disown me 3 times." And he went outside and wept bitterly.
We are really getting close to the end of Matthew's Gospel. In fact, this is the end of chapter 26. We only have one more to do, and I'm going to cover 27 next week. So in 2 weeks, we actually move to Mark. Because there's a theme that starts on the Passion Week, where Jesus enters Jerusalem, that goes all the way up to Easter. And it's the same theme, it just gets a lot stronger. And that'll all make more sense next week. I will bring out a couple of the interesting points that are in 27. But while we're at the end of 26, we have this trial. You know, remember, Jesus was in the garden last week. He got grabbed and off he went. They took him to this, it's basically a trial. The timelines that are going on at this point, you could go to scholars and they'll tell you things didn't happen as fast as they did. But for us, we're not worried about how long it took or how many days it took. These are events that are important for us to know. And that's why God had the author of Matthew put it in the order for us. High priest and the Sanhedrin. The Sanhedrin would be like Congress today. They might have gotten a little bit more done than our Congress did, but that's kind of a toss-up thing. And the high priest, of course, he's the guy, the religious head of the entire religion. And you have to have the high priest there if you're going to accuse someone of blasphemy. He's the guy who's going to decide these things. But a few interesting things. Culture-wise, first, Jesus, as you know, is from Galilee. We are in Jerusalem right now, which is in Judea. Jews in Galilee were different than Jews in Judea. In fact, if you were a Judean Jew, you looked down upon Jews who came out of the Galilee. Because the Galilee, that territory, was surrounded by pagan cultures. The Decapolis was on one side, Syria was in the north, Lebanon was out to the west, and they just didn't kind of like each other. Which is very strange because they're all kissing cousins. But that be it what it may. The people in Jerusalem actually had a different dialect of Aramaic than the people did in the Galilee. For example, if you go to Pittsburgh, you will be asked if you would like to have some pop with your dinner or lunch. And those smiling know that means soda. Or when you come from New Jersey, which I did live there for a little while, it's not something I talk about much. And you come here and ask for pot pie, and they give you that bowl of soup. That's not pot pie. Pot pie has crust. I know you call it baked pot pie. So even though they spoke the same language, even though they had the same religion, there were things between them that were different. And people in Jerusalem really didn't understand Galileans and vice versa. Okay, that's fine. A couple things that were brought out in there is the title Son of God. And we see that in different places. What's interesting is Jesus almost never calls himself Son of God in Matthew. But Son of God was a title of honor and distinction. It was something that you said about your teacher, your rabbi, your priest, the person that was running your synagogue in your town. You would call a son of God. So all of us could be called sons and daughters of God. And that is a legitimate title. There's nothing special about it in the culture of that day. Now, what the church has done with it is something else. We're not worried about that, right? We're going back to the original meaning. So when they said to him, "Are you the Son of God?" he didn't say yes or no, but he does in a couple of the different versions say, "Son of Man." He called himself Son of Man quite a bit, and that was a title for a peasant. And coming out of the Galilee, that would have been a term he would have heard quite often. So notice even here at near the very, very end of his life, Jesus was still humble. He was considered himself a peasant, nothing that tremendous. And you notice that it's going to continue. If you want to go ahead and read 27 during the week, you're going to see Herod's going to say something like, "Are you the king of the Jews? Are you the Son of God?" And Jesus is going to simply say, "No, I'm a Son of Man." Or he's not going to answer, which implies the same thing. Humble to the end. Let's see what else we got. Then Jesus said, right, you'll see the Son of Man. Notice he didn't say Son of God. He says Son of Man coming in the clouds or on the clouds. What that meant, and it's an Aramaic expression, that his mission will continue with great honor. This is something God wanted him to do. What I find interesting about this section and a little bit about the drama piece is that your high priest and your Sanhedrin knew what that meant. That's the blasphemy they're catching him on, by the way. It's not that he said the temple's going to be destroyed in 3 days. That's not what they jumped on when he made this statement, coming in the clouds of heaven and sitting at the right hand of God. That's when Caiaphas does his ripping of his clothes and yells out blasphemy, not the temple. Interesting, isn't it? Sitting at the right hand of God means that people will see that God is supporting this mission. This is a divine mission. That's what that statement means. It does not mean he's physically sitting at the right hand of God. I have always had a question about that because we talk about the Trinity, Father, Son, and Spirit all in one, right? But then it says well, I guess you could do that. Sit on your own right hand. No, it's not very comfortable. But I always wondered about that. There's going to be some throne up there. That's not what it meant when he said it. And it makes more sense in understanding Trinity to understand that when he said, you're going to see me sitting at the right hand of God, it meant that God is backing this mission. Father God wants this to happen. All of 27 is part of that. And he's going to come back in glory. And the glorious glory of the mission, as you can see, are all these churches everywhere and the 800 million or so of us that believe in Jesus and follow him. But then the high priest yells blasphemy, which is wrong. He knew better, and he tore his clothes. Now you sit there and say, why would he do something like that? Well, normally, if someone dies in your family, in your bloodline, you would tear your clothes as a sign of mourning. However, this is bad. What the high priest did was blasphemy, not what Jesus did, because it says in Exodus that the high priest's robe, what he was wearing, was considered sacred, and you're not allowed to tear them. Says it right there in Exodus. God tells Aaron that your clothes are sacred, high priest sacred, no can tear, and he does it. You probably never thought about that or heard about that. I thought, why is he tearing his clothes? Nobody died. Well, if he didn't like what he heard, people did that in ancient times. Usually it was non-Jews that tore their clothes, but he tore the sacred robe. He's the blasphemer. So those who had saw this story, saw this narrative, or saw this playing out, or heard it later on, when it was written by Matthew, would have understood. Jesus wasn't blaspheming. That's a tough word to say. It's the high priest that was. What he said was God's way. Clouds, right hand. Spitting in faces was something that was done way back when, and of course it was a sign of mockery. Please don't go and do that today unless you're wearing your face mask. Think about that for a minute. No testimony. Notice we start the trial and we have these words of really no testimony was found against Jesus as what? The revolutionary. Remember last week I told you that and showed you in the scripture where he's grabbed by the guards because they thought he was an insurrectionist or a revolutionary? Well, that's what they're trying him on first. But nobody could come forward and give a collaborating story. In other words, they got a bunch of people to tell a bunch of fibs, right? False witnesses. None of the stories matched up. Okay, we're standing here as the Sanhedrin for a moment thinking, how can we condemn this man as an insurrectionist when we have absolutely no proof? The Jewish people could not do capital punishment. It's the Romans that did it. That's Roman law. So they're going to have to go to Pilate, which they're going to do in the next chapter, and they got to take Jesus there and say, this man deserves death, and here's why. And if Pilate turned around and said, let me hear the witnesses, they knew that the insurrectionist route wasn't going to work. So they threw that out. They went after the blasphemy. He did not commit blasphemy. But the Romans wouldn't have known that. They would have heard those words and Pilate would have taken them as we have literally through the centuries and said, wow, this is blasphemy. Now that you know what it means to be on the clouds in the right hand of God, you know that he didn't say anything wrong. In fact, he's proven his point of who he is, isn't he? He's telling you what his mission is. The other thing that's interesting about this trial is Jesus said nothing till almost near the end of the whole episode of the narrative. He was quiet in the garden when they grabbed him. He's quiet in front of Caiaphas until toward the end he says, well, you said I am, and that must be the way it is. Because he knows it has to be done. Remember, he went through this. He was in the garden. We had the prayers. We went through all of this. And he knows that what's going to happen has to happen for God's mission to continue, which, of course, he is part of. He's God. So he's quiet. Now, this one I thought was intriguing. When they turned around and spit at him, right, and hit him, some of them said, prophesy, who's hitting you? He's not blindfolded. He could see who's hitting him. And I went, wow, wait a minute, that's really weird. So you go into Mark and Luke and John, and guess what? He's blindfolded. If you go watch the Passion of the Christ, he's blindfolded. But we're in Matthew's gospel. Matthew doesn't say he's blindfolded. So I'm like, wow, this is really interesting. This is what happens here. Scholars will say that there's a blending of these stories. First is Mark, then there's Matthew, then there's Luke. That's the chronicle. And I'm only telling you that's the scholastic thought. We really don't know if they were or weren't. But the stories feed into each other. But it's interesting that Matthew, author, left out the blindfolding. I just found that fascinating. Don't have a reason for you, I wanted to point that out. We call it harmonizing when we read the story of Matthew and say, of course he was blindfolded. No, he was blindfolded in the other three. It's harmonizing when we put them together and come up with the storyline. So after 2.5 years of Matthew, you understand, hopefully you remember all these things, that we have to be careful not to harmonize. Caiaphas was the high priest. I just want to let you know something about him. From 19 CE to 36. Now, Jesus is going to die somewhere between 30 and 33. It's kind of a jumble. We don't have exact chronology. Caiaphas was from the house of Caiaphas, that's where he got his name from. That was a high priest family. Kind of like, I don't want to go there. It's similar to things that happen today. A family takes over and they never let go of power. That's what was happening back then. You go with that one if you want. I almost said something I didn't want to say. But they weren't going to relinquish power too easily. Caiaphas is very concerned about himself because if a riot occurred during the Passover, Pontius Pilate made it very clear to him, you are going to die. Pilate gets sent to Judea by Tiberius, the emperor, for one reason only: to maintain order. A legion of men are sitting up in the Galilee. That's like 5,000 men who could not go to the front. Remember, they're battling the Parthians. Rome is fighting the Parthians. Those are the guys that rode on the horses that were archers. Nasty people, too. They're battling them, and here you got 5,000 men, a whole legion sitting in the Galilee, because every year at the Passover, there's a riot that goes on. So they sent Pilate in because, he was nasty, and he was going to take care of the problem. And he did. But you can see where Caiaphas and the Sanhedrin, they're covering their you-know-whats, and they don't want that riot to occur. The interesting thing that we have to remember is that Jesus was a man of peace all the way to the end. And part of the reason he dies the way he does is because he lived and we lived in a sinful world. And we're being told to remember that because we can be so overwhelmed by evil. And we have to think about that. And what we do and what we say, but more of what we do, our actions reveal, are you a righteous person or are you an evil person? Or are you somewhere probably in between? As I like to say, God is from Missouri and he says, show me. Don't just tell me a bunch of words. Don't just sing a bunch of hymns, but you got to show me that you truly do believe by what you do. And we all have to deal with it. We have to be able to confront evil. Jesus was confronting evil. We're going to go through 27 and I'm going to show you how evil is going to build itself up right up to the crucifixion. Every one of these stories, starting at Passion Week, every one of them is a build-up. And Jesus is going to confront it all the way up to the cross, and then for the next day or so until, of course, Easter. But what he's showing us is that love and grace can conquer evil. But you sit there and think about that for a moment and say, okay, he loves your enemy, love your enemy. He was quiet. He went through the whole shebang, but he died at the end. But what changed? Everything's going to change after Easter occurs. Everything's going to really change after Pentecost comes. Because he's going to show us how to battle evil. You battle evil with love and grace, but you don't let evil run over you either. The Bible does say you're allowed to defend yourself. In this particular case, Jesus was told, right, in the garden by God the Father, you're just going to have to go through this. Because all of the ways of Jesus, all the secrets that are in the Gospels, all these things we've learned out of Matthew's Gospel for 2.5 years is going to be proven true on Easter Sunday. So think about that. When you run into evil, how do you react to it? It is not easy to show love to people you really can't stand. But that's what we're taught to do. And it's not easy. And we have to love ourselves because we live in a world that is consistent of what we call positive and negative energy. I'm going to give a little mystics for a moment. And positive energy, it's inside of each and every one of us because we're the image of God. But you need negative energy. If you don't have negative energy, we don't have lights and panels, and poor Dennis would have to play the piano because the organ couldn't work. So you need this negative energy, but negative energy builds up and becomes evil. And when it builds up spiritually inside of you, that's when you become evil and wicked. And Jesus tells us you can fight that with love and grace and joy. You got to keep it under control because it's in each and every one of us. We got to control it. So think about that during the week. Read chapter 27. I'm not going to show all of 27 next week. It would take like a half hour. But think about that. That as you go through your days and you go through your weeks and years, you confront this negative energy. It's going to become part of you. And how do you deal with it? Because it's there. And Jesus shows us that love and grace conquers that negative energy and it conquers evil.